is that it's not Jesus' love for Peter that they need to be reminded of. That's never in question that Peter loves him. Because when Jesus died, his last interaction he had with Peter was seeing Peter deny him. That's a pretty bad last interaction before death, right? But Jesus didn't ask Peter to repent. He didn't ask Peter to confess. He didn't ask Peter to, justify his actions before he went and died for him. He died for him at Peter's very worst moment. He died for Peter so he could be reconciled back to God. Because Peter couldn't stand on anything that he had done to reconcile himself back to God, but he could stand on the grace of Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus didn't make Peter cough up an excuse, but instead Jesus poured out the biggest sacrifice of love and grace that has ever existed for Peter, so that Peter could have new life, so Peter that could be brought into Jesus' mission for him. He did that for Peter, and he did that for us. He did it for me, and for you, and for all of us.
Yeah.
When Jesus raises from the dead, there's new life possible in all things. There's new life possible in each one of us. God doesn't wait until we're perfect to call us into mission. He meets us where we are, and he feeds us, literally feeds us, and calls us and sends us out. In my story, I sat in the midst of my guilt and shame, feeling unworthy of being able to be used by God at all. But in that moment, God reminded me that I was never worthy in the first place, at least not by anything that I had ever done.
Wow.
Good or bad. My actions can never save me, and it's only by the grace of Jesus that I can do anything. It's only by the grace of Jesus that I can be used by him. He calls me worthy, and he invites me into his mission. This isn't just a one-time event, but it's actually something that's manifested for us each day, over and over. Every time we deny God's presence, or every time we turn away from him, his love and grace happens each day. Jesus already knew that Peter loved him, but Peter messed up. So instead, Jesus entered back into Peter's life and brought out his love for Peter and called him once again into his mission. For my Sabbath, I had chosen technology, and I had chosen laziness to bring me rest, instead of choosing into Jesus' rest for me. But in that, Jesus entered in and brought me into his presence. God entered into my life this moment. I suddenly picked up my Bible because I was like, I gotta fix this, I'll just read my Bible. That was like my solution. Like, right, that's what I see up there. Jesus talked to me. But instead of reading my Bible, I just heard the word go from God. Go, go. And so I threw on my running clothes and shoes, and I got my keys and I left. I started going on my run. I was feeling pretty good about myself because I was like, oh, I'm finally running towards the park. I'm working it out. I'm fixing it. And then I got a really bad side ache from the donuts. It hurt so bad. And so I had to walk. I was so frustrated. It was my fault again, so I started to feel guilty again. By that time, I was up at Stowe Lake. I don't know if any of you have been to Stowe Lake in Golden Gate Park, but it's one of my most favorite places in the city. There's tons of birds, there's trees, there's a bunch of old people walking their dogs. Great, I love it. This one old man every morning always says, "Good morning, young lady," as I'm running by, and I just love that place. It brings me a lot of joy, especially that one man. That particular morning, the water was super glassy. Have you guys seen that water that is just so still, super shiny water? And in that moment, Psalm 23 popped into my head. Or I like to think Jesus put it into my head. And it's actually about Jesus being a shepherd for us. He leads us by still waters and into mercy. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. You restore my soul. Jesus was not only showing me his rest, but he was also redeeming my sin of laziness. He was restoring me. He was gently bringing me back into his presence in a way that spoke to me best, through nature, through this particular place where I felt God's presence. Just like a good shepherd does, he invited me into his purposes for that day, leading a small group, working at the YMCA, loving the people around me. That was what God had for me that very day, and I had to choose into it in that moment. For Peter, Jesus' call for him was to shepherd the first church. That was what Peter did. He preached the good news and helped other people follow Jesus. But isn't that each of our calling? To carry on Jesus' mission and to bring people into the presence of Jesus. Jesus' mission was to bring new life into the world. It was to break in and to reconcile us back to God so that we wouldn't think we'd have to save ourselves. Because we always fail. We always mess up. We'll always eat too many donuts, or we'll always deny Jesus. Whatever it looks like, we can't do it, right? I think one time when I was a kid, for probably a good month, each day I would wake up and I'd say, I'm going to be perfect today. I'm going to be perfect. I'm not going to, because my mom had told me each day we sin, we can't have a perfect day. And I was often strive to do that. We strive to be perfect, or at least appear perfect. But that's why Jesus came. That's why he entered into our world, to actually make it possible for us to be reconciled back to God, not by what we do, but through what he does. And what's cool about this mission, too, is that it extends across generations, and it extends all over the world. That when we enter into God's mission to bring new life into the world, it's not something that dies when we die. It's something that continues across the generations until Jesus returns to make all things good again for good. The work of Peter led to the salvation of many people. The early church grew and grew, and I think the only way that could truly happen was by each person owning the mission that God had given them. They couldn't have done it if they had kind of half chosen it. But the church grew because people fully bought into what Jesus was calling them to do. I think the best example I've heard of this was actually in the first couple of centuries of the Roman Empire after Jesus had died. Two significant plagues really hit that area, and a lot of people were dying. So most of the people fled, all the dying people, all the plague. But the Christians felt God calling them to not abandon their neighbors. So they stayed. Where everyone else was going, the Christians in the Roman Empire stayed with their neighbors who were sick. They fed them, they gave them water, they prayed for them, and they just gave them the opportunity to share life together. They gave them the ministry of their presence, just being together, making them feel like a person, not just a plague. They firmly believed that Jesus died so that people could be healed physically and spiritually, so they stayed with their neighbors. These Christians had radical love for their neighbors. This wasn't like a, hello neighbor across the bushes type of love, but this was a love your neighbor as yourself sort of love. This was a, I'm going to risk my life for you sort of love. This was a sacrificial love that they had. And it actually turned out that a lot of these people didn't need some miracle medicine to make them better. They just needed regular things like food and water and people around them. So a lot of the people that the Christians ministered to ended up being saved. They survived the plague, and when they got better, they wanted to know what kind of God that these people followed that would compel them to stay behind with all these dying people. And many, many of those people found the love and salvation of Jesus. I'm sure that those Christians weren't perfect, nor did they really believe that what they were doing would make that much of a significant impact. They were being faithful to respond to what God had called them to do. They were being faithful to respond to God and to his mission, to radically love people around them. How do we respond when God calls us into his mission? I believe that God is calling us, our InterVarsity here, you and me, to radically love SF State. That is the place where we find ourselves right now, and God is calling us to love our neighbors here at SF State. He's calling us to radically love our dorm mates by inviting them to small group, to radically love the people in our classes by listening to them and being interruptible, offering prayer to them. He's calling us to take a risk and share our faith next week on campus at our proxy station. Do we let our inadequacies hold us back? We could stand on a lot of excuses for why we shouldn't love our neighbors radically. Not enough time, I'm not good enough. I don't know how to share my story. I don't know how to enter into a spiritual conversation. I don't have enough answers. I don't know all the answers to everything. But clearly Peter wasn't qualified either. He had denied Jesus at the moment that Jesus needed him most. But Jesus came back, showed Peter his love for him, and called him anyways, just like Jesus is calling us. We can't say that we're ready to share Jesus with our roommate because we have proven that we can share the story perfectly, or that we can lead a Bible study because we have all the answers, or that we know how to engage in spiritual conversations because we've had all this experience. We are just like Peter, and we need Jesus' love to be able to love our campus. We are saved by his grace, and it's from there that we receive new lives for ourselves. And new life doesn't look like standing in a circle where we just say that we love God with each other and just affirm that all together. New life looks like declaring our love for Jesus, accepting his love and grace, and going forth into his mission to love our campus. So there's new life possible in our roommate who is upset and lonely and bitter because of her parents' divorce. There's new life possible in the skeptic, in the atheist who has been hurt deeply by the church. There's new life possible in our city who talks a big language of justice, but spends their money only on themselves. There's even new life possible in our world where hunger, poverty, injustice are the overwhelming themes and events that we hear of. There's new life possible in all things because of what Jesus has come to do. And there's new life possible in the world because of what he is going to do through us. If we believe that there's new life possible in our own hearts, if we own that for ourselves, then we are called to preach Jesus' good news, that new life is possible to the rest of the world too. Jesus didn't just save Peter from his sin, from his denial of Jesus, from his impatience, from his big mouth. He saved Peter for something, for leading the church, for carrying on Jesus' mission, for spreading the good news of Jesus, and for radically showing love to his neighbors. If we sit here thinking that Jesus only saved us from something, then we're not truly living out our salvation. For what mission has God saved us for? For loving our roommates, for sharing our testimonies with our project partners in class, for engaging in spiritual conversations with the campus so that people can come to know the saving love of Jesus that we have received ourselves. How will you join in God's mission tonight? How can you radically love your neighbors for Christ this week? Who is it that you can invite to small group? Who is it that you can invite to the proxy station? Who is it that you can invite to large group next week? For those of us who would call ourselves Christians, is God calling us to let go of our past sin and inadequacies and calling us into his mission? Can we commit to coming on Sunday, to sharing our faith, and then actually showing up next week for the proxy station to do it? I know that it's a risky step to actually be able to share with our words what Jesus had done in our life. But as a community, I think we can do it. And for those of us who maybe wouldn't identify as being Christian, but you've been checking out Jesus for a while, what is it that's holding you back from saying yes to Jesus? Do you feel like you need to have everything together before you say yes to Jesus? That you have to know all the Christian answers or have every detail of your life figured out? Jesus invites Peter into following him and participating in his mission before Peter has anything together. Peter has gone back to fishing. And that's what we all are. We're still messy. We're still in process. And that's why we're figuring it out together. So for those of us who wouldn't identify as Christians, I think there's an invitation for you tonight to follow Jesus and to see what mission he has for you. I'm going to give you guys a chance to think about it. I'm going to invite the worship team up. And I'd like